Sì, buongiorno a tutti,
Good afternoon. My name is Rossella Sobrero, and I've been dealing with sustainability for over 20 years. Media organizers asked me to have a small presentation because sustainability has been a hot topic during these days. Compared to last year, for example, we see that this topic has become paramount in this industry as well. We saw yesterday, for example, that companies were awarded for the sustainability enshrined in their strategy, and they presented innovative ideas both in terms of stand setup, but most interestingly on products too. The title of this presentation is Sustainability as a Competitive Factor, as a factor in competitiveness, because sustainability is today more than ever key in many different industries. Some industries started very early, for example, agri-food, the energy sector, and partly the finance world as well. But today, the fashion industry has approached these themes as well, and has found in sustainability a distinguishing mark as well. But I always think that if a company declares declare that they will focus on sustainability, well, that decision must be serious and strict and targeted. If a company decides to go along a sustainability path on a step-by-step fashion, they must be clear, authentic, and measurable in their targets. Statements like I'm sustainable, I'm 100% green have never worked actually, and they cannot work, especially now. Sustainability must be a strategic choice. Sustainability
è quello rosso. Ah, è lei che la manda avanti. Ma la freccia a destra non andava, vabbè. Risolviamo semplicemente schiacciando il pulsante giusto. Quindi anche le iniziative, diciamo, di filantropia.
So also philanthropic initiatives, for example, donations to a non-governmental organization, or the idea of or the decision to support a local project are not wrong. On the contrary, but on their own, they're not enough to declare that a company is sustainable. A company is sustainable when it changes its business model, when the key elements of the core business are changed. Just to make an example, if a steel mill writes in his social report that they installed the big water dispensers so that the employees do not buy plastic bottles any longer, but they don't say anything about what they changed in their production process. Well, this doesn't mean anything to me. What I want to know is what changes have you made in order to modify and adapt these businesses. And you have to be sincere and very clear in what you say, because otherwise you run the risk of simply greenwashing what you say. Well, now more than ever, changes are very strong. As we heard from Felice Limosani, the market is changing. And people are willing to have different experiences. And in this respect, emotions play a greater role than in the past. However, we have to realize the context we are in. Unfortunately, the context that surrounds us is not easy at all. And so, besides macro scenarios that unfortunately are extremely worrisome, we have to understand how people think nowadays and how companies can properly react to the needs of a market which is changing. We are living through a period of metamorphosis. And a metamorphosis is something deeper than a superficial change. It implies a change in behavior, in the way companies are set up and are willing to stay on the market, the way we consume, we study, and we act. And we have to realize that this metamorphosis pertains to all of us, both human beings and organizations. But as I said earlier, we are living in a very complicated period. As you can see in the slide, there are a lot of facts and figures. I do not want to dwell on them. They are also quite boring. But we have to consider one thing. The world population is continuously growing. This year, there has been a slight drop, but clearly, the more people there are, the more raw materials are consumed and the more energy is needed. So this staggering growth should lead us to reflect upon how to organize our society. In the second part of the slide, you see a phenomenon which is often neglected.
This is to say, the average life of people gets longer and not by little. So, if on the one hand we are all happy because we believe we have a longer life expectancy, on the other hand we should also reflect on how institutions, the public administration, but also enterprises should respond to the aging of the population that is so fast. And this figure attracts my attention. The number of people over 65 years of age will be 2 times more than 5-year-old children, and it makes us reflect the theme of climate crisis, and it's useless to say it. It is a concern to each one of us, and perhaps we're not concerned enough about it. There are impressive data telling us that this continuous increase in production and consumption causes a very, very strong impact on the climate and, for example, on the oceans. And just in the past 2 or 3 years, perhaps we have realized that the seas and the oceans are getting warmer and warmer. When you go swimming, it's pleasant, but it's not a good sign. And in the last 7 years, the temperatures of the ocean have always increased. And so the marine ecosystems are jeopardized, and many people that live also. And think about us in Italy, how many people live along the shores and live on fishing. And it's a world that should be considered with due attention. And here you see a figure that perhaps I hope it's a wrong estimate, but a major international institute tells us that in 2050 we'll have 1.2 billion people that will be environmental migrants. They will be obliged not to live where they were born, but to change place because of rising seas, the increase in temperature, drought, and we are concerned about 100 people getting to our shores. It's right to be concerned, but think about 1.2 billion people moving. It's impressive numbers, and also investors that put in money are concerned, and BlackRock, the biggest investment fund in the world, is telling enterprises that they should be concerned about such problems. And even in a previous statement, Larry Fink, and is the chairman of BlackRock, he said that they would stop financing those companies that were not active to fight against climate crisis. And what does all of this cause? Social inequalities. In the period of the pandemic, well, we saw that some countries, just like Brazil, Argentina, but not only that, started a process to reduce the gap between the extremely rich and the extremely poor. It went back, and it's something that we should consider. And inequalities are connected to the fact that technologies run the risk of setting aside some people that don't have the ability to adapt. They lose their job, but overall there are certain situations that make the rich richer and the poor poorer, and the average class, the middle class, is getting poor, and perhaps also in the case of Italy in terms of business, the middle class supports the Italian economy. And everybody speaks about circular economy. Perfectly okay. At long last, it's in everybody's minds that we should reduce waste. But we see that actually this doesn't give big results. Why? Because global consumption of energy and materials are increasing considerably because the population growth, and so more and more is being produced. When we speak about fast fashion, it's an irreversible trend. I hope that it stops at a certain point, but if we collect used clothes and we give back a coupon to buy new clothes at a low price, we'll never end it, and consumption will be high, and circular economy will be a drop in the ocean. An important sign coming at least from Italy, as far as I know, you have the phenomenon of industrial symbiosis. What does it mean? It means there are two companies that have understood that the waste of an enterprise can be raw materials or semi-finished products for another industry, and it goes beyond, and it's much more than circular economy. It means creating virtuous cycles where circulation of products at the end of life is reduced, energy consumption is reduced, and you try and follow the course of natural processes, reconverting what is a surplus in a process and using it for another process. Artificial intelligence is progressing with some fears, but also some positive elements, and today we can rely on a huge corpus of data. And then, I don't know if you heard this morning, hackers arrive in France, but it seems that there are also major Italian groups, and they cause big crises because such a big amount of data can make access vulnerable. It can make a company vulnerable. And we've understood that some big problems, just like the problems I've mentioned so far, can be tackled just if you adopt an interdisciplinary approach. What does it mean? It means that it's not enough to have a scientist, to have a chemist, to have a geologist. You also need an expert at humanitarian affairs, and just as a result of a comparison of different disciplines, can you get effective solutions? And there should be more attention to diversity, every type of diversity, be it gender diversity, diversity between generations, differently abled people, ethnical, religious diversity. Diversity should be considered a value because the world is made up of different people, and in teams of companies, for example, having people that have different cultures and approaches, the control of the supply chain becomes more and more strategic. Enterprises are asked to be responsible for what happens in production sites, but to also be responsible for what happens before and after. A sustainable supply chain helps companies do better. And another important theme is measurement of the impact. We should measure the results of what the company does. It's not enough to say, I am committed for the environment. They should say how they do it, how they are measuring, and the positive impact your action has created. And fortunately, people are more aware and more responsible, and hence you have an increasing number of consumers paying attention to what they buy, and it's obvious that we're still far away from fully responsible consumers, but there are good signs, and the commitment of companies increases for the social dimension. For so many years, they measured the environmental impact, how much CO2 has been saved, and how much efficiency has been achieved in water systems. But the S that stands for social is very important, and hence, yes, a company should pay attention to the pressure it exerts on the environment, but it should give its own contribution in its support to the community and attention devoted to employees. Having said this, sustainability in this scenario becomes more and more important, and it can become, for those that do things seriously, a communication lever. So for companies, companies should adopt an overall approach that can then be recognized by all stakeholders, be they internal sales network or external clients, suppliers, communities, and so on and so forth. And everybody speaks about relational capital. What is it? It's the value that is assigned to organizations and for their ability to consider all stakeholders and to listen to what stakeholders can say, consider stakeholders important and include them in their own strategy. Managing relationships with social protagonists increases value, a value that is more and more considered by investors. And then they speak about enterprise citizenship. What does it mean? It means simply that an enterprise should behave just like a good citizen. It should respect the place where it is to foster the development of the territory. It should try and also have an important role in the strategy of the place where the company is and where it works. And companies are asked to establish a relationship with stakeholders because today enterprises are glass houses where everybody can see inside, and reputation today is considered to be a precious value. And somebody says that we've gotten into the era of the value of reputation. So they speak about economy of reputation. Intangible assets today represent a much stronger asset than intangible assets in most cases. We cannot be general. So a company that wants to be sustainable should also define a specific strategy, but also communication with a gradual path that brings about results, taking into account that a company should generate positive results also in the short term, but also considering the medium long term. And I use this way of saying that an enterprise should have strabismus, consider with one eye tomorrow, but also with the other eye the future. Today everybody speaks about brand activism. The activism of brands has also been codified by a guru of communications, Philip Kotler, and he says that today there's no brand that cannot afford not to deal with a social or environmental problem. Participating in the construction of the common good is considered as a fundamental element for the future of the company. So you shouldn't simply give a donation and a non-profit project. It's not enough. You should really be fully committed, but before doing so, the company should always consider objectively the results achieved and be critical and self-critical and understand the positive elements and the negative elements, to be honest, because I believe that saying that you couldn't reach an objective, well, it makes you credible. And it's not a negative. A company that admits not having attained 100% its objectives it set, it is more human and then more sincere, and it avoids being accused of greenwashing. And we'll speak about it shortly, about greenwashing. And sustainability communication helps the company create more participation and share with its own employees visions and future strategies, and work to the benefit of the local community. And it helps a lot to create a favorable climate. And I'm also deeply convinced about the educational role. If a company, for example, teaches to use its product better, it sends messages, for example, on how to reduce energy consumption. It is carrying out an educational activity that can be done by the state and by schools, and it's welcome that they do as well. But the strength of a commercial communication getting into the homes of all the Italians through TV, for example, but also online, it can foster cultural change. However, be careful, because unfortunately there are also many greenwashing risks. Greenwashing is considered to be the evil son of green marketing of the 70s, that wanted to highlight those products that had a lower environmental impact. And the risk is that if you don't tell the truth, and if you don't tell it well, a positive aspect, because green marketing has a positive aim, it is then transformed into a danger. And so it makes people distrustful and trying to identify truthful information and separating them from greenwashing practices. Greenwashing was invented in the 80s by an American activist, and perhaps its history. He went into a hotel and he found that message we are accustomed to, that says, just if you place this card on the bed, we won't change the linen and the towels because it's beneficial to the environment. he states, and hence the greenwashing term, that it was not true that the company was interested, it was a hotel chain interested in the environment. They simply wanted to save money, and it's perfectly okay to save money. And hence the origin of the word greenwashing. It's greenwashing that doesn't have to do with the fundamentals of the company.
Di greenwashing ce n'è tantissimi, ne sentiamo tutti i giorni.
Of course, there are many different cases. I don't like to speak about cases that have not been proved, maybe because they are just too recent, but we have a few examples coming from the past, and they're useful to understand what kind of risks a company can run. Well, in this case, Westinghouse organized a few years ago a great campaign in order to explain that with their nuclear plants, they save pollution, they reduce the pollution. And it was true, because compared to a carbon plant, the pollution was, of course, more limited, without considering the great damages provoked by nuclear waste. You can understand perfectly well that the whole world, the activism world, of course, was against this campaign, because they said that was a typical greenwashing campaign. Well, another company, I just go back, I don't know if you can see it properly, a very old ad campaigns. Well, another company that was accused of greenwashing is Chevron. Well, Chevron, very famous, this campaign. So the company was telling that in drilling in a protected area of the country, they were able to recover or recover the same area without environmental damages before the bears do wake up for spring. And of course the company was attacked. Well, once again, Chevron, because of course the oil multinationals have always been attacked, Chevron declared that they were interested in sustain the protection of a specific species of butterflies, that species that was going extinct, and they gave $5,000 in order to create areas to protect these butterflies. And activists, they said that the company invested $5,000 for the preservation of the butterflies and millions to communicate this action. Well, greenwashing is not only that I'm telling lies, because I mean they were telling that they created these protected areas, and it was true, but as you can see, something is terribly wrong here, and they were accused many times by different activist group. On the web is easy to find them. Chevron, I think, is one of the most controversial companies out there. Well, remaining in the same sector, so gas or oil multinationals, this is another very famous case, British Petroleum, and they even changed the logo. Now they are BP. They invested millions of euros or dollars in a rebranding campaign to say that they were working in favor of clean energy. And they signed, at the same time, they signed agreements with activist groups. And because of that, they were really at the center of the attention for many authorities. That's another campaign, Ryanair. In 2019, they had to close this campaign because they were telling that they were the greenest air company of the planet, but it was not true at all. Because they were, fly with Ryanair because we have the lowest CO2 emissions compared to the other European air companies, but it's not true. they were just calculating in a very convenient way this figure. Well, in Italy, we have the Self-Discipline Institute in Italy. So when we see something that is not true, well, almost also normal citizens, so we can really denounce them. And I mean, these companies, they have to pay attention because they've been exposed many times. We talk a lot about greenwashing, but on the other side, now we have the social washing. That is, everything that companies are explaining and telling in an untruth way on social aspects out there, and then the blackwashing as well. Well, the blackwashing is, I mean, it's something more common in the United States that started in 2020 after the death of George Floyd, because the Afro-American movement, that was the strongest, the most important movement has been in the last years, accused companies that supported this movement only after that media really cover these issue, these problems. So those that sustained the rights of Afro-Americans before this event, that was okay. But those that decided to sustain this topic after the death of George Floyd, that was blackwashing. And then the sport washing. Well, the World Championship in Qatar is a typical example of sport washing. Well, Qatar is a country, apart from the last scandals with the European Parliament and so on and so forth, we don't really need to pay attention to that, but choosing of organizing the World Championship there, it was to hide, because, I mean, sport can be a synonym of positivity, the positive values, solidarity. Well, they were up there, they were trying to hide the lack of interest for human rights. And then, so the greenwashing, as I said, is define the dark side of sustainability. And we need to fight the greenwashing, because otherwise the victims can be also companies that are working properly. Because for consumers, we are all the same. So you're doing something wrong and we are all the same. If you believe in sustainability, you really need to pay attention to communicate only what you are doing properly, for sure, and if you can measure the results, even better. But do avoid to declare your principles, because that can be considered greenwashing. And then we can have ways to avoid greenwashing. For example, well, in various sectors have worked giving suggestions to their companies. Here we have 3 sectors, where the fashion word, that is probably the closest to our word, our sector. Well, this is the opinion of an expert that says that we need to be brave enough to be transparent, to admit criticalities, problems and difficulties. That's really a signal of responsibility. Better numbers than adjectives. Communicate on data, something that can be proved, and use instrument and method that you can measure. And also in glasses, I mean, we have different elements, lenses, frames, well, the case. Well, sustainability also in our sector means that a product, of course, can be better, always better, but at the center we have specific values, and the sustainable product needs to find better solutions for every single phase. Well, on finance, we need to be very transparent, because as investors or small investors, if you're not able to understand the final offer of a specific fund, we need to ask to someone that is more knowledgeable or knows more, in order to avoid criticalities or avoid critical funds. And then the agri-food pays a lot of attention with avoiding to use an excess of, let's say, claims, greenwashed claims. Well, I was trying to run a little bit, or to talk a little bit faster, because I know that we have another meeting in 10 minutes.
Conclusioni. Il cambiamento deve...
Well, conclusions. So I mean, we need to be the first to change. We can ask companies to be more responsible, but we do have the same responsibility as citizens. Well, and then sustainability cannot just be communication or a communication activity. Otherwise, the term itself just loses meaning. So the greenwashing is very dangerous because, as I said before, if you just use the right words, we tell about our social commitment, well, we can run the risk to I don't know, to lie to the consumers, creating images that are not true. So once again, we have small and big risks. I wrote a book about this that was published a few months ago, and I'm talking in this book about let's say not very serious sins. So those, I mean, for example, when I want to speak about how good we are without proving with data what I'm saying, and then we have, of course, the worst sins that are those when we lie on purpose. Normally, more vulnerable consumers, those that have less cultural instruments, they are easier to be lied to. So we need to protect these more vulnerable consumers in order for the communication to be, and the communication needs to be sincere, truthful, and very correct. Companies, they don't have to think that they need to target a target. They need to create a communication, a dialogue. We know that today communication means relation. And it's important to involve the stakeholders. I conclude with a quote from Sartre: every word has consequences and every silence too. Well, it's important to reinforce the reputation of a company, but in a very truthful way, in order not to be accused of greenwashing. A company needs to pay attention on how it works and how, I mean, it communicates what they do. Thank you. I'm here available for your question in case you have some.
C'è qualche curiosità, qualche domanda?
Do you have something you want to ask? Are you curious about something?
5 minuti d'anticipo, sarà contento il prossimo relatore.
So I just finished with 5 minutes before, so the next speaker will be pleased.